Hi folks, it's almost Christmas. Early October, you've got 2.5 months to come up with some really unique Christmas gifts for the people that you really like to give something to. I love to build boxes. In fact, I can't tell you how many thousands of boxes that I've built over the years, just based on how many I still have kicking around. Add to that all the ones I've sold or given away. It's quite a representation. So what I want to do is inspire you a little bit, maybe give you some ideas, talk to you a little bit about the hinge, sizes of the boxes, and some joint options. I build boxes. This is the smallest of the Woodhinge boxes I built. Obviously, the lid's not on yet. That's a ring box, and it's made out of pieces that you would normally sweep up and throw in the garbage. But if you were to look around my shop, you'd see I never throw out any pieces of wood because you never know when you're going to turn into a gem. So let's just go through and I'll pick some of these out. And here's one I built. Now, by the way, some of these boxes have been around, in case you're wondering about the durability of the hinge in particular. I made this one in 1988. Another old one. This one was about the same vintage, late 80s. And this one, date on that is 1999. This one's hard to read. I don't think I signed it and put the date on it. This one was 2006. And the wood hinge still operates after all those years. I'll show you that in a little more detail in a bit. So here's this. I'll start with this one. I made this one for my daughter Erica, and this is out of cherry, all dovetailed. In fact, I was bringing it home from the shop. I was at BYU at the time, and didn't I drop the box right on the edge of the concrete curb walking out of the shop? That's that ding. Survived all these years. Has a not a coopered lid. Well, I guess it is a coopered lid. It's several pieces all glued together and then shaped. Has a little lid stay made out of woods, what I meant to say. And then you've got your little sliding box, little sliding trays, and the trays are dovetailed as well. And I used leather on the bottom, both in the bottom of the box and the bottom of the trays. You had to have little stops put in there because you didn't want the tray to go over and interfere with the lid stay. I think I may have had to replace this once, I'm not sure. And there's the bottom one. And if you're wondering why Erica doesn't have it, I think she surrendered it to me for a while until her kids got a little bit older and it didn't get destroyed. So this is cherry all the way around. Here's one I made not that long ago. This is dovetailed by hand as well. This is out of walnut. The only downside to walnut is it tends to fade away with exposure to UV light, and you lose that nice dark color. You can see the difference on the lid from the inside to the outside. But this one's a nice example of how that hinge can completely disappear. You don't see it, and then you do. The bottom is pine. It has a floating bottom, so this is a solid piece of wood. Actually, this is cedar, sorry. And it fits in a groove on 4 sides. And the groove is a little bit deeper than the bottom is wide, so that as it expands seasonally, it won't interfere with the box. It's allowed to move, shrink, and expand depending on the season. And nothing else to talk about on that. And this one does not have a lid stay, but the hinge on this case is made out of 3/8 inch dowel, so it's a little bit stiffer, and it's certainly enough to support that. I make that little finger catch just with a, I think I used a 3/4 inch drum sleeve, it chucked up into a cordless drill, and just hold that with really aggressive grit and hold it in place until it hollows that out, and then change to a finer grit and eventually finish it off by hand. But it's just a spot so you can put your finger in there to open the lid. Now, by the way, I like it when the lid fits down in between the 2 sides. It gives you a nice close fit. It doesn't slam. And it's a little bit tricky in terms of finishing it off, but it's doable. Now, I always break the joint with a little V-groove. If you don't, this is a solid wood top, so this is going to move, shrink, and expand as well. And if you have 2 sharp edges coming together, the minute that moves, you're going to notice it. Whereas if you have a V-groove, on a little V-groove or a little chamfer on both pieces, then that hides that joint line. Doesn't hide, well, it masks any movement. Now get away from the wood hinge ones for a minute. This is one that we used to do in our class, and we're going to now reintroduce it. This one's been beat up, it's traveled around a lot. This one is made entirely with hand tools, so everything started out as rough lumber and got to this stage with hand planes. It's actually a piece of mahogany and poplar of all things, and this is a half blind. It's a little bit thin, but we did it anyway. And then the lid is a flat piece that we've shaped around, and we have a little rabbet all the way around that just fits in there just snug enough so that it stays in place. And it's been abused. Here's one that's in unfinished state, not nearly as pretty. I haven't finished off with the lid in terms of shaping it somehow, but this again is just a teaching sample. So it's got a cedar bottom with poplar sides and walnut. Why poplar? Don't know. Here's one out of cherry and aspen. And that just played with the lid a little bit just to do something a little bit different. Now this one I purposely had the lid, or the rabbet on the lid, extend out beyond the side so that when you grab hold of it, you've got that little bit of a lip right there that you can comfortably hold on to the lid. Here's one. This box has been around a long time. I built this in the late 80s. This was done out of all cherry. In fact, I remember this one got destroyed on our trip home back in 1989. I had to put a new lid on it. But this one I actually made the dovetails proud, which is difficult to do because it really complicates the gluing process. All these little dovetails, pins, and tails have to be chamfered beforehand. You got to chamfer the right amount so it doesn't go down below the joint line. If it does, it shows as a gap instead of a nice little chamfer. And then I carved a little recess with a carving chisel. This one has a leather stay. You can buy this round, 1/8-inch round leather and just drill an 1/8-inch hole in both pieces, put in a little bit of glue, and it acts as a lid stay. This too has a solid wood top. You can see where this has been damaged because, as I said, I had to go in and replace the lid. And I left the hinge proud on this one as well. Solid wood bottom. There's another one. A couple of variations on the way we do it. As I mentioned, this one, this is a piece of bird's eye and wenge. This one, the lid sits down in between the two sides, which also allows you to finish off your hinge nicely. When I first started doing them, I did a lot like this, where the box is completed, then you cut the lid off, and then you apply your hinge so that you actually see it right out here on the end. And it makes for a thicker lid, but depending on whether or not you like that. This has got a leather bottom. I always like to put something in the bottom that's a little bit different than what they expect. So it's maple on the outside, then you open it up and it's leather, which is also nice too because as you put contents in there, it just kind of deadens the sound and makes it, dresses it up a little bit. Same idea. Take that little drum sander and cut a little finger recess in there so that when the lid's closed, number one, it tells you which side to open, and number two, it gives you that little spot to get your finger in there. Now, this is a box joint, and my video on building boxes, I show you how to make this jig so you can go in there. And what I did when I first designed this, to get away from that vegetable crate look of box joint where fingers or pins and tails are the exact same size, this one I did the spacing so that you had a wide finger, a wide pin. I'm going to try it again. Wide tail, narrow pin. And this looks a little more like a dovetail without the complexity of having to cut the dovetail. This is the one made out of all walnut. And the problem here is I used a piece of burl on the top. And that with burl, you really can't tell which way the grain's running. So there are times of the year when you cannot get that lid open. It's so tight it expands. Normally, with your grain running this way, that does not change in dimension, so you can make that a nice snug fit, and at no time in the year does it ever jam. But this one, I learned my lesson on that. It's actually snug right now. That was 2011. This one's been around a long time. I think the date on this is 1999. This is a piece of Purple Heart and some figured maple. Now this bottom, haven't been able to find it anymore, but this is a felt product that had an adhesive back on it, so you would peel it off and stick it on there, and then it gave you it came in various colors, but again, it just dressed up the bottom a little bit. Always sign them. Now talk a little bit about some variations on what you can do for the joint. I've got hand dovetailed. I've got the finger joint, or box joint, better stated. Now here's one where I miter the piece. This one's not finished yet. So the corners are mitered, and then what I did is I took my dovetail saw and I simply sawed the shape of a dovetail. So I would be cutting on an angle like this, did all of those, and then I took a piece of, I think in this case it was ebony veneer. And sometimes you have to take the veneer and pound it with a hammer on something, on a steel table, so you can squish it just enough to get it to fit in there. Now I use little triangles, slide them in place, put them all in, and then just put cyanacrylate on it. Now cyanacrylate will wick, and that'll pull it in. It causes the wood to swell a little bit, and of course it sets it up, and then you just flush it off, and it gives you the outline of a dovetail, which is just a nice feature. This will end up with the same type of lid as this one if I ever get it done. Now I used ebony on this, so bird's eye maple on the outside, gaboon ebony, which I really wasn't thrilled with the way it turned out, so probably the reason why it hasn't been finished, and then black leather on the bottom. Someday. I do a lot of these. These are a business card size box. There's one that actually, I think a piece of, well, yeah, there's a chunk out of it. That's why I never got finished. But a business card fits in there. So it makes a really nice gift for anybody who has business cards sitting on their desk. And I set up my jig so I could do hundreds of these. There they are. And I'll come back to this one and show you a little more about the hinge, because that one's actually got the hinge ready to install. Let me see what else. I'll talk to you a little bit about our wood hinge kit, so how you make these accurately. Here's one that I made. Oh yeah, I want to show you this one too. This I made out of a piece of really figured maple, and I used the same. This was the first time that I built a box where I didn't have any contrasting wood, so the entire piece, including the hinge, was all made out of this figured maple. Little tiny skinny dovetails. Unfortunately, this got damaged on one of the wood shows we were doing. You can see all the scratches in the top. But on the bottom, I used deer skin. I thought, oh, it felt really nice. The problem, what I didn't realize is, when I put this together and then had to put the finish on afterwards, I used painter's tape to cover the protected deer skin. But the nap on it was so fragile that even with taking the painter's tape off, you can see how that got damaged. So, word of caution there. What else? All right, let's talk. Oh, here, one last thing. This is a partially finished small lap desk. So the lid would come down like this with a leather insert for writing on, and there's some internal parts. But this is made out of walnut with a pine bottom and half-blind dovetails. Hopefully we'll get to finish that someday. Okay, so here's the drill kit. Here's an example of where I'm using it as a lid on a standing desk we're making. So it's nice and uninterrupted surface, and then there's your lid opening, and it is extremely strong. What you're working with is the strength of two pieces of wood being glued together, which essentially makes it one piece of wood. And in between each segment, you have a little steel rod. And depending on how far into or away from the surface that hole is drilled, that's your only weak link in the entire process. So I'll try to go through this just quickly and give you the highlights. There's your box bottom. Actually, let's use this one because I've got the pieces marked. You use what's called a core box bit, and I've got some samples here. A core box bit simply is a bit that cuts half the radius of a circle. So this is a 1/4 inch. So that's going to give you half of a 1/4 inch circle. This one is 3/8 and this one is 1/2 inch. So you can get them in various sizes. And you need to match those to your dowel. In this case, I have 1/4 inch. So with my core box bit in a router, mounted on a router table, you have part of the fence, pardon me, is covering part of the core box bit, so that prior to assembly, and you're cutting the groove on the back of your box, it would be cut like this. So you would imagine this being disassembled. You're taking this piece and you're running it over your bit, and that gives you more than a 1/4 of a circle. And the reason you have to have more is you have to encompass more than half of the dowel when the whole thing is together, so that you don't expose that pivot pin. Now that's all explained in the video, but just to give you some idea of what's going on. And then with the exact same setting, so the back of your box would stand upright like this and passes over the bit, and then your lid lays down flat and passes over the bit. And you got to play around with it until you get it just right. But once you've got that, you take your dowel, and I always draw a line on there so I can match the grain up afterward, cut it into segments. Okay, and that piece of rod is usually about 1/4 of an inch long, maybe a little bit longer. And before you assemble, you have to have your dowel all put together, and you're going to glue part of the dowel to the bottom, and the other part is going to get glued to the top. And you can see where the little ticks are that I have marked on each piece where the joint line is. Because when I put that dowel in place, part of the dowel is going to be glued to the bottom, the next section is going to be glued to the top, the next section to the bottom, the next section to the top, next section to the bottom, and so and so. That way it'll work as a hinge. But you're gluing here, and you don't want any glue here. So what I would always do is go in, I would wax wherever I don't want glue to be. So on the bottom of the box, I'm going to wax from that line to that line. Then I'm going to wax from that line to that line. This hinge has to be put in, completely assembled, and the whole thing glues together at the same time. So you've got to make sure that none of that glue, if it squeezes out, is not going to seize up the other part of the joint, or the hinge. Now, that sounds complicated. It really isn't. Watch the video and you'll figure it out. It's quite easy. Here's our kit. We offer 2 different kits. We offer one in metric. That's got the little ring around it you'll see on the pieces. So that's the approximate metric size that is close. So this is the imperial. So it comes with all the parts to, if I can get it out, all of the parts to make 4 different size hinges. Jake, I don't think I'm going to be able to get that out of there. That tube got dented. There. So you take your, work with this big one. This one allows you to make an 1/8 inch. So this would be larger boxes. In fact, this is the type of size that I would use on making a hope chest. So there's 2 little set screws on either side. So you're going to have your drill sticking out beyond the end of that threaded rod by the amount that you want to drill into the piece of dowel. So in other words, it's going to be sticking out a little better than half the length of your rod. Tighten that up. Now this part goes into your drill. And then depending on the size of the dowel, whether it's the 3/4 or the 1/2 inch, you're going to thread that on. Now, you spin it like so, And then you take your dowel and you push it into the end. Now, the first thing that's going to happen is this accepting piece is going to hold the dowel on center. And then as you push it, it drills perfectly on center. These little holes are exit holes. That came loose on me. Are exit holes for the shaving so that you don't having to stop and unclog that every time. And then you just simply take it out, turn around the other side, do that end, and you get these perfectly centered holes. If you don't have something like that, what happens is in the process of trying to drill a 16th inch diameter hole in the middle of a 1/4 inch piece of hardwood, you can imagine that's going to wander and go wherever it wants, or at least follow the path of least resistance. This little jig holds that in place so that that cannot wander, and you end up with a perfectly centered hole. Works really slick. When you buy the kit, you have the option of getting the rod with it, which is enough to make lots of people happy for Christmas boxes. We have both the 16th inch rod and the 1/8 inch rod. So there's your kits, there's your rods. All you need to do is provide the skill, the craftsmanship, get yourself a router. Make sure you get a good bit. Sometimes you got to experiment a little bit, and I'll just end by telling you this. Take your bit and simply use it to run a groove in a piece of wood. And then take your dowel and set your dowel in that groove. Let me show you this because this is important. It'll fail otherwise. Now, I don't have a piece. Oh, yes, I do, right here. Take your dowel and make sure that after you've cut your groove in a piece of wood, that you set your dowel in there, that it'll make contact all the way around. You need to have good glue surface in order to have this thing stand up and have boxes that'll last centuries. Merry Christmas.